Chuck, Darren said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable authority. This isn't about you following the rules. This is about treating people with basic respect. What you've done here isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been judged by the color of their skin, by the way they dress, or by the assumptions someone else made about them. Chuck's face reddened, but he didn't say anything. His lips trembled slightly, but he was too stubborn to admit fault. Instead, he kept his arms crossed, glaring at Darren as though willing him to back down. The two off-duty officers who had stepped in earlier exchanged looks, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons, but they didn't draw them. They were watching, waiting for Chuck to understand the gravity of what he had done. The younger of the two, a man with short cropped hair and a steely gaze, finally spoke up, his voice low but firm. "Chuck," he said, his tone measured, "you're out of line. You're harassing this man for no reason, and you're making everyone here uncomfortable. You need to step back and let the manager handle this." Chuck glanced at the officer, his nostrils flaring, but he didn't respond. His pride had taken too big a hit already, and he wasn't about to let someone, especially an off-duty cop, tell him what to do. The younger officer's words hung in the air, heavy with a truth that Chuck had clearly failed to grasp. Darren stood tall, unwavering. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He was no stranger to difficult situations, but this one felt different. The tension, the crowd, the way things had escalated, it was all too familiar. He had seen it before in the streets and courtrooms, and even in the hallways of his own precinct. But here, in this moment, he was just one man standing up for what was right, for what needed to change. The mall manager stepped forward again, her voice almost pleading now. "Sir, please, let's resolve this privately," she said, her tone apologetic. She clearly understood the weight of what was happening and wanted to diffuse the situation before it spiraled further. But Chuck wouldn't budge. "Nothing to resolve here," Chuck muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Darren to hear. His defiance only fueled the fire. Darren took a step forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "Chuck, listen to me," he said, his eyes locking onto the guards. "You've made a mistake, and the longer you deny it, the worse it gets. But it's not just about you anymore. It's about everyone here. Everyone watching. We have a choice in how we treat people. And right now, you're choosing wrong." The crowd was silent now. Phones continued to record, capturing every moment, but the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just about a mall confrontation anymore. It was about justice. It was about the kind of world they all wanted to live in. The kind where judgment was based on who you were, not what others thought you were. And Chuck was about to realize just how far that judgment would go. But before the moment could unfold any further, Darren's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at it, his expression hardening as he read the message. It wasn't from anyone in the crowd. It was from his precinct. Something had come up, something that demanded his attention. Darren knew he couldn't let this moment pass without saying something. But the situation was quickly becoming something that would require more than just words. Darren slipped his phone back into his pocket, his jaw tightening. The message on the screen was a reminder of his responsibilities beyond this moment. But he knew leaving now could send the wrong message. This wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what might happen next. Every decision he made now would echo through the crowd, the recordings, and perhaps even the larger conversation that would inevitably follow. He couldn't walk away, not yet. Not while the tension still hung so heavily in the air. Chuck remained rooted in place, his face a stubborn mask of defiance. He could feel the pressure mounting as more shoppers gathered, their whispers growing louder. Some muttered words of disapproval, their discontent clearly directed at him, while others tried to remain neutral, unsure of what to make of the situation. The mall manager, now visibly uneasy, stood nearby, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She had hoped Chuck would step back and defuse the situation, but it was clear he had no intention of doing so. As the seconds ticked by, one of the off-duty officers finally broke the silence again, his voice calm but firm. "Chuck, You're not helping yourself here. The longer this goes on, the worse it's going to look. For you and for the mall. Let it go. Chuck shot him a sharp glance, his pride refusing to yield. I'm just doing my job, he snapped. If people have a problem with that, they can take it up with corporate. Darren tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. Your job, he said, his voice steady, is to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone in this mall. Not to single people out because of your assumptions. You've crossed a line, Chuck, and the more you dig in, the clearer that becomes. The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones still trained on the unfolding scene. Darren could see the shift in their expressions. What had started as curiosity was now turning into quiet outrage. These were everyday people, shoppers, parents, and workers, who had come to the mall expecting a simple, uneventful day. Now they were witnessing something that many of them had only ever read about or seen on the news. A moment where prejudice clashed with justice in a public setting. Among the onlookers was a young woman with her toddler balanced on her hip. She watched the scene intently, her phone angled to record, but her focus on Chuck. Her soft voice broke the silence. He's not wrong, she said, directing her words toward the guard. We've all seen this happen before. People like you picking on others just because you can. It's not right. Chuck stiffened, his gaze darting toward her. For a brief moment, his expression faltered, as though the weight of the crowd's judgment was finally starting to register. But he quickly hardened his stance, his voice rising in volume. I don't have to explain myself to you, he barked. I'm enforcing the rules. That's all. Darren's patience was running thin, but he maintained his composure. He stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. Chuck, look around you. Listen to these people. They're not on your side because they see what's happening. They see what you're refusing to admit. This isn't about enforcing the rules. It's about how you're choosing to enforce them. The mall manager stepped forward again, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed Darren. Captain Hayes, please, let us handle this internally. We don't want this to escalate further. Darren turned to her, his expression softening slightly, but his resolve unchanged. I understand your position, he said, his tone measured. But this isn't just about handling it quietly. This is about accountability, about setting an example for everyone here. He gestured to the crowd. They're watching, and they deserve to see that this kind of behavior has consequences. The manager nodded slowly, her eyes darting toward Chuck. She could see the truth in Darren's words, even if she didn't want to admit it. Chuck's behavior was not only unprofessional, but also a liability for the mall. The growing crowd and the countless phones recording the incident were proof of that. Yet, she hesitated, unsure of how to proceed without making things worse. Meanwhile, in the crowd, a middle-aged man wearing a business suit leaned toward one of the off-duty officers, speaking in a hushed tone. Doesn't the mall have a policy against this kind of behavior? Surely there's something in the code of conduct about discrimination. The officer nodded, his expression grim. There is, he replied quietly. But enforcing it requires the right people to step up. The businessman frowned, glancing at Chuck, who was still standing rigidly, his defiance unwavering. Well, it looks like someone's finally stepping up, he muttered, his eyes shifting back to Darren. The tension continued to build as more voices from the crowd began to speak up, their words carrying a mix of frustration and solidarity. This isn't right, one woman said. He's just trying to shop like anyone else. Yeah, another voice chimed in. We've seen this too many times. It's time someone called it out. Chuck's face reddened as the voices grew louder, their words chipping away at the walls he had built around his pride. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of the crowd's judgment was becoming too much to ignore, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. Darren took a deep breath, his voice cutting through the growing murmur. This isn't just about me, Chuck. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of someone else's bias. You have a chance to make it right, to take responsibility for your actions, but that choice is yours. Chuck stared at him, his jaw tightening as he struggled with his own pride. The crowd waited in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the guard. Darren's words hum in the air, a challenge and an opportunity all at once. The question now was whether Chuck would take it, or whether his pride would continue to blind him to the truth. The air in the electronics store was electric, thick with anticipation and tension. Darren stood steady, his gaze locked on Chuck. The crowd pressed in closer, their whispers growing softer as they waited for the next move. Each second felt longer than the last, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on everyone involved. Chuck's expression flickered, torn between his rigid pride and the growing realization of just how far this had gone. Among the crowd, someone muttered, he should just apologize already, and another voice responded with a soft, "Do you think he will?" The onlookers had shifted from casual observers to invested participants, their presence amplifying the intensity of the standoff. Children clutched their parents' hands, wide-eyed and confused by the scene. Adults exchanged glances, silently questioning what they might do in Darren's position, or Chuck's. The mall manager, visibly nervous, stepped forward again, her hands clenched tightly together. "Chuck," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I think it's time to step back. This has gone too far." Chuck's head snapped toward her, his pride bristling at the implication. "You're taking a side?" he asked, his tone sharp and defensive. "I'm the one enforcing the rules here. I'm the one doing my job." "You're the one escalating this," Darren interjected, his voice calm but firm. "This didn't need to become what it is now. But you made that choice, Chuck. And now you're standing here, digging your heels in, when everyone can see what's really happening." Chuck's face darkened, his jaw tightening as his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out verbally, but then he froze. His eyes darted to the crowd and the countless phones still recording. The realization of just how public this had become hit him like a wave. The weight of his actions was no longer something he could dismiss or explain away. Darren, sensing the shift, didn't let up. "You have two choices, Chuck," he said, his tone measured. "You can keep doubling down, making this worse for yourself and everyone else. Or you can take a step back and show the people here, your coworkers, your boss, this crowd, that you're capable of doing the right thing." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective disapproval now fully directed at Chuck. The mall manager nodded slowly, her face etched with both regret and resolve. She knew Darren was right. This wasn't just about the guard anymore. It was about the mall itself, its policies, and the message it was sending to everyone watching. She turned to Chuck, her voice firmer now. "Chuck, you need to stand down. This isn't negotiable." Chuck's defiance faltered, his posture shrinking slightly as the pressure mounted. He glanced at Darren, then at the crowd, his face a mix of anger and uncertainty. For a moment, he looked like he might relent. But then, as if grasping for control, he squared his shoulders and took a deep breath. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he said, his voice shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear. "None of you do?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and the tension reached a boiling point. Darren stayed calm, his expression unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but the air around him seemed to crackle with quiet authority. It was then that the off-duty officers stepped forward, their badges flashing the fluorescent lights. The taller of the two, a man with a calm but commanding presence, addressed Chuck directly. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You're out of line, Chuck, and you're making this worse for everyone, including yourself." Chuck turned toward him, his frustration spilling over. "I'm just doing what I've been trained to do," he said, his voice defensive. "Why is everyone acting like I'm the bad guy here?" "Because you're not acting like a professional," the officer shot back. "You're letting your pride and your assumptions cloud your judgment. That's not what we're supposed to do, especially not in a position like yours." The crowd murmured again, their voices rising in agreement. Darren took a small step forward, his calm composure unwavering. "Chuck," he said softly but firmly, "it's not too late to make this right. But the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be, for you, and for everyone involved. The silence that followed was deafening. Chuck's face twisted in conflict, his body rigid as he weighed his options. The crowd watched with bated breath, their phones still capturing every second. The mall manager stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Chuck," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "if you don't step back now, I'll have no choice but to call corporate myself." And you know what that means. Chuck's eyes darted between her, Darren, and the crowd. The reality of his situation was sinking in, but his pride fought desperately to keep control. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt almost suffocating. Darren remained still, his presence steady and unyielding, as if daring Chuck to make the right choice. The crowd waited, their anticipation palpable, as the standoff teetered on the edge of its breaking point. Just as the tension seemed unbearable, with Chuck standing rigidly and the crowd holding their collective breath, a voice cut through the air, a voice none of them expected. From the back of the crowd, a young woman stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. She was dressed casually, carrying a shopping bag, but her presence was commanding. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "I think everyone here needs to hear what I saw earlier." The crowd shifted, making way for her. Chuck's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, clearly caught off guard. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. "My name is Amanda," she replied, her voice steady. "And before this escalates any further, I think everyone should know that I saw you following this man long before you approached him in the store. I noticed how you were watching him, like you were just waiting for an excuse to confront him." A ripple of shock went through the crowd, and all eyes turned back to Chuck. His face darkened, and his jaw clenched as he sputtered. "That's ridiculous. I was doing my job." "No," Amanda interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest. "I watched you ignore plenty of other shoppers. People loitering, people browsing. You only seemed interested in him." Chuck's mouth opened, but no words came out. Darren watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable, while the off-duty officers exchanged knowing glances. The crowd murmured louder now, the tide of opinion clearly turning even further against Chuck. Amanda continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "You singled him out, and you know it. And now you're doubling down instead of admitting it was wrong." The mall manager's face paled as she turned to Chuck. "Is this true?" she asked, her tone sharp and accusatory. Chuck stammered, his composure cracking further. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had moments ago. Before anyone could respond, another voice joined the fray. "She's right," an older man said, stepping forward from the crowd. He was dressed in a suit, clearly someone who wasn't just another shopper. "I've been watching this unfold too. And I'd like to point out something else. This isn't the first time Chuck has been accused of this kind of behavior." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Chuck's face turned crimson. The mall manager's eyes widened in shock, and she turned sharply to the man. "What do you mean?" she demanded. The man sighed, his expression grim. "I'm a regular at this mall, and I've seen this happen before. Chuck has a habit of targeting certain shoppers, making them feel unwelcome. It's not just this incident. There's a pattern here." The crowd erupted into murmurs, and phones tilted to capture every angle of Chuck's growing discomfort. Darren remained still, his gaze fixed on Chuck, who now looked cornered, his bravado completely stripped away. The off-duty officers stepped forward again, their expressions hardening. One of them spoke, his tone serious. "This just keeps getting worse. Chuck, you need to stop digging this hole." Chuck's face contorted, his hands trembling as he glanced between the crowd, the manager, and Darren. "This is a setup," he blurted out suddenly, his voice desperate. "They're all ganging up on me. You don't know what it's like to deal with people in this place every day." "Stop," Darren said, his voice cutting through Chuck's frantic rambling. It was calm, but carried a weight that silenced everyone instantly. Darren stepped forward, closing the gap between himself and Chuck. "This isn't about you being overwhelmed. It's about choices. You made a choice when you approached me. You made a choice when you escalated this, and now you're making a choice to avoid accountability. Chuck opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the store. A group of mall security officers appeared, led by a stern-looking man in a crisp uniform. The man's badge read Chief of Security, and his expression was one of controlled anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying an authority that rivaled Darren's. The mall manager stepped forward quickly, her voice tight with tension. "Chief, we've had an incident," she said, gesturing toward Chuck. "And it's becoming very clear that this isn't an isolated problem." The chief's eyes flicked to Chuck, narrowing as he assessed the situation. "Chuck," he said, his voice low but firm, "I've warned you before about how you handle situations like this." Chuck's mouth opened, but no words came out. The chief didn't wait for an explanation. Instead, he turned to Darren, his expression softening slightly. "Captain Hayes, I sincerely apologize for this situation. This is not how we run things here." Darren nodded politely but didn't speak. The chief's gaze swept over the crowd, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "I'll be conducting a full review of this incident." "And Chuck," he said, his tone sharp as a knife, "you're suspended immediately pending the outcome of that review." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices drowning out Chuck's protests. Phones captured every second as the chief gestured for the other security officers to escort Chuck away. Chuck resisted briefly, but the weight of the moment was too much. His shoulders slumped as he allowed himself to be led out of the store. As Chuck disappeared from view, the energy in the room shifted. The crowd's cheers died down, replaced by a quieter sense of vindication. The mall manager turned to Darren, her expression one of deep regret. "Captain Hayes," she said softly, "on behalf of the mall, I can't apologize enough." Darren met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Apologies are a start," he said, his voice steady. "But change is what matters. This isn't just about me. It's about the culture you allow to exist here. That's what needs to be addressed." The manager nodded, her face pale but determined. "It will be," she promised. "You have my word." The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, their eyes still on Darren. He stood tall, his presence commanding even in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. Among the departing crowd, Amanda approached him, her expression earnest. "Thank you for standing your ground," she said softly. "People needed to see this." Darren offered her a small, genuine smile. "It's not just about standing your ground," he said. "It's about making sure people understand why it matters." As the last of the onlookers filtered out of the store, Darren turned to the off-duty officers who had supported him. They exchanged quiet nods of acknowledgement, a shared understanding passing between them. But even as the tension eased, one lingering thought remained clear. The fight for accountability wasn't over. This was just one moment in a much larger battle, and Darren knew it. As the crowd dispersed and the air in the mall began to settle, Darren stepped out of the electronics store, his calm demeanor unshaken, but his mind replaying the events that had just unfolded. The off-duty officers walked alongside him, their quiet solidarity a reminder of the strength found in unity. Darren could feel the weight of the incident, not just for himself, but for everyone watching. He knew the ripple effects of moments like these could linger far beyond the walls of the mall. Just as he reached the main atrium, a voice called out behind him. Turning, Darren saw the mall manager rushing toward him, her face flushed, and her steps hurried. In her hand, she held a small envelope. "Captain Hayes," she said, slightly out of breath, "I wanted to make sure you had this before you left." Darren hesitated, taking the envelope. "What is it?" he asked, his tone measured. "It's a formal written apology," she explained, her voice tinged with remorse, "and a commitment to review and overhaul our policies. What happened today should never have happened, and it's my responsibility to ensure it doesn't happen again." Darren nodded, slipping the envelope into his pocket. "It's a start," he said evenly, "but accountability requires follow-through. Words mean nothing without action." The manager's expression softened. "You have my word, Captain." Before Darren could respond, a soft commotion drew their attention. Near the entrance of the mall, a small group of people gathered, their voices hushed but urgent. Darren's instincts kicked in, and he excused himself, heading toward the scene with the off-duty officers close behind. As he approached, the murmurs grew clearer. "It's him," a woman whispered, pointing subtly toward a man standing apart from the group. He was tall, with a sharp suit and a briefcase in hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about his presence that felt out of place. Darren's eyes narrowed as he observed the man. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" The woman turned to Darren, her face pale. "That man," she whispered, "he's been lurking near the exits. He's not shopping. He's just watching." Darren stepped forward, his authoritative presence immediately commanding attention. The man turned slightly, locking eyes with Darren. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Then, without a word, the man began to walk away, his strides purposeful. "Hold on," Darren called, his voice cutting through the chatter. The man didn't stop. Darren exchanged a glance with the off-duty officers, and together they moved quickly to intercept him. "Sir," Darren said again, louder this time, as they closed the distance. The man finally stopped, turning slowly to face them. His expression was calm, almost too calm, and his voice was measured as he spoke. "Is there a problem, officer?" Darren's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. "You seem to be in a hurry," he said, his tone neutral but probing. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" The man shrugged, his movements controlled. "Just passing through," he said. "No law against that, is there?" Before Darren could respond, one of the off-duty officers stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. "I've seen you before," he said slowly. "You've been around the precinct, haven't you?" The man's composure faltered for a split second, a flicker of recognition flashing in his eyes. Darren caught it immediately. "You're not just passing through," Darren said, his voice low but firm. "Who are you really?" The tension escalated as the man's gaze darted between them, weighing his options. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a badge. Darren's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the emblem. It was federal. "Agent Mark Ellis," the man said, his voice devoid of the earlier casualness. "I'm here on an undercover operation." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through Darren and the officers. Darren's expression hardened as he stepped closer. "Undercover? Doing what?" Ellis hesitated, clearly weighing how much he could reveal. "We've been monitoring this mall," he admitted. "There's been a string of illegal activities tied to some employees here. Chuck Harding was one of our key suspects." The air seemed to shift again, the layers of the situation deepening in an instant. Darren's mind raced as he processed the information. "You knew about Chuck?" he asked, his voice sharp. Ellis nodded. "He wasn't just a security guard. We believe he was involved in coordinating thefts and reselling stolen merchandise. Today's incident wasn't just about profiling. It was about covering his tracks. He thought you were onto him." Darren felt a surge of anger and disbelief. The confrontation that had seemed so personal was now part of something much larger. "Why wasn't I informed?" he demanded. Ellis' expression was apologetic but firm. "We couldn't risk compromising the investigation," he said. "And to be honest, Captain, we didn't expect today's events to unfold the way they did." Darren took a deep breath, the weight of the revelation settling over him. The crowd had dispersed, the mall had quieted, but the implications of what had just come to light were staggering. Darren turned to Ellis, his gaze piercing. "This doesn't excuse what happened today," he said firmly. "Chuck's actions, undercover or not, were unacceptable. And the damage he's done, both to individuals and to trust, can't be overlooked." Ellis nodded. "Agreed," he said. "Chuck will face consequences both for his misconduct today and for his involvement in the larger scheme. Your actions today brought all of this to light sooner than we anticipated. For that, I owe you my thanks." Darren didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the mall, his thoughts on the people who had watched, recorded, and judged the events of the day. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was about systemic issues that demanded attention. As Ellis turned to leave, Darren called after him. "Make sure your investigation includes more than just Chuck," he said. "This place needs more than justice. It needs change." Ellis nodded, his expression serious. "We'll do our part," he promised, "and I trust you'll do yours." With that, Ellis disappeared into the crowd, leaving Darren and the off-duty officers standing in the atrium. Darren exhaled deeply, his resolve stronger than ever. The day's events had reached their peak, but the fight for accountability and equality was far from over. Darren knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle, and he was ready to face it. The bustling mall was alive with the hum of activity, a haven for shoppers seeking holiday deals. Families wandered through stores, their hands filled with shopping bags, while children marveled at the glowing decorations. The festive cheer seemed to envelop everyone, except for one man who moved through the crowd with a sense of purpose. Chuck Harding, the mall's security guard, carried himself with an air of authority. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor no nonsense. Known for being overly vigilant, Chuck prided himself on keeping the mall safe, though his methods often drew whispers among employees and visitors. As Chuck scanned the crowd, his gaze fell on a tall black man browsing the electronics section. The man stood apart from the usual hustle, exuding a quiet confidence that immediately caught Chuck's attention. Dressed in polished shoes, dark jeans, and a neatly pressed polo shirt, the man appeared relaxed, casually inspecting the newest gadgets. But Chuck's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Something about the man, his posture, his presence, seemed off to Chuck, though he couldn't quite place why. With a firm grip on his belt, Chuck adjusted his badge and strode into the store. The man didn't notice him at first, too engrossed in reading the specifications on a sleek tablet. Chuck cleared his throat loudly, drawing the man's attention. "Excuse me, sir," Chuck began, his tone firm but laced with an edge. "Can I see some ID? We've had complaints about loitering." The man turned, his expression calm but questioning. "Loitering?" he repeated, his voice even. "I'm shopping." Chuck crossed his arms, his stance widening as he leaned in slightly. "Well, you look out of place," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. "Let's not make this difficult." A murmur passed through nearby shoppers who had begun to slow their steps, drawn by the interaction. Some glanced at the man's composed demeanor. Others exchanged uneasy looks. The tension in the room grew palpable. The man, still calm, reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. Holding it up for Chuck to see, he said evenly, "Captain Darren Hayes, 15th Precinct. I'm here on personal time, shopping for my nephew. There's no issue here." Chuck barely glanced at the badge, a smirk creeping onto his face. "Could be fake," he muttered dismissively, his voice rising just enough for those nearby to hear. "Doesn't change the fact that you're making people uncomfortable." By now, a small crowd had gathered, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. Phones emerged from pockets, cameras poised to record every word. Darren Hayes remained unshaken, though his eyes flicked briefly to the growing audience. He met Chuck's gaze once more, his voice steady, but carrying a sharper edge. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but I suggest you choose your next words carefully." Chuck, emboldened by the crowd, took a step closer. "People like you don't scare me," he declared, his voice echoing through the store. The words struck like a thunderclap, eliciting gasps from the onlookers. Darren's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he stayed rooted, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the escalating situation. Before Darren could respond, two men in casual clothes stepped forward from the crowd. Their movements were deliberate, their eyes locked on Darren. One of them, a tall man with a badge clipped to his belt, raised his voice. "Captain Hayes, everything okay here?" The air in the store shifted as recognition dawned on the crowd. Whispers rippled through the group, and the phones recording the scene shifted their focus. Chuck turned to the newcomers, his brow furrowing. "Who want you?" he snapped. The tall man's expression hardened. "We're off-duty officers. and you're talking to the captain of our precinct." His voice carried a weight that silenced the murmurs for a moment. Chuck's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "I don't care who he says he is," he shot back. "This is my mall, and I'm doing my job." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Darren finally broke his silence, his voice calm, but resonating with authority. "Enough," he said, his gaze locking onto Chuck. "This isn't about your job. It's about something much bigger." The words hum in the air as the crowd leaned in, their attention riveted. The manager of the mall, alerted by the commotion, was now pushing her way through the sea of onlookers. Her face was pale with concern, and her eyes darted between Chuck and Darren. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Chuck opened his mouth to respond, but Darren raised a hand silencing him. He turned to the manager, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. "I suggest we step aside for a private conversation," he said. But before she could respond, Chuck cut in, his voice loud and defiant. "I don't need to step aside for anything," he barked. "I'm just following policy." The crowd buzzed louder, the tension now electric. Darren's eyes met Chuck's one last time, his expression unreadable. "Then let's see how far your policy takes you," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a promise. The scene was at a boiling point. Everyone watching could sense that what happened next would change everything. The mall was growing quieter now, save for the murmurs of the crowd and the faint holiday music still playing in the background. Most of the shoppers had stopped their own browsing, their attention now fully on the scene unfolding before them. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the outcome of this small, seemingly insignificant exchange would somehow echo beyond the mall's walls. Darren could feel the eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He'd faced tougher situations, had stood in the face of larger challenges, but this was different. This wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about something deeper, something more personal. He was a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting his community, but in this moment he felt as though he was also standing for something much bigger than himself. He was standing up for dignity, for respect, for the principle that people should not be judged based on the color of their skin or the assumptions others made about them. Chuck, on the other hand, was growing more agitated by the second. His pride and authority were being challenged, and he wasn't used to this kind of pushback. He had been a security guard at the mall for over 15 years, a position he had come to view as his own domain. It gave him power, a sense of control over the lives of others, even if that power was limited to keeping people from violating store policies. But his actions today were starting to feel like they were crossing a line. The more he glared at Darren, the more he realized that his role here wasn't as clear-cut as it had seemed. Despite his growing unease, Chuck refused to back down. His lips curled into a thin, defiant line as he tried to maintain his posture. The onlookers, whose phones were now recording every moment, continued to watch in silence, their faces a mix of curiosity, confusion, and in some cases, judgment. He could feel their eyes on him, but he refused to show weakness. This was his territory, his domain, and he wasn't about to let some off-duty cop make him look bad. Darren, for all his composure, could see the fear in Chuck's eyes. He could see the wheels turning in the man's mind as he realized he had made a grave mistake, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. Darren could sense that this confrontation wasn't just about the misunderstanding. It was about Chuck's inability to accept his own flaws and the system that had allowed him to hold power for so long. Chuck had likely never been called out like this before. It wasn't something he had ever expected, and certainly not in a public setting like this. The stakes were higher now, not just for Chuck, but for everyone watching. As the two men stood locked in a tense standoff, the mall manager grew visibly uncomfortable. She stood a few feet away from them, wringing her hands in frustration. She had seen this kind of thing before, security guards asserting their authority over people for no real reason, based purely on their assumptions. But what was happening now was something entirely different. The man Chuck had targeted wasn't just any shopper. He wasn't some random person who could be intimidated into submission. This man was a captain in the police force, a man who had likely seen more than his fair share of confrontations, but never one like this. Darren could see the manager's distress, and he knew that this situation was slipping beyond control. It wasn't just a misunderstanding now. It was becoming a public spectacle. He wanted to calm things down, but he also knew that if he didn't speak out now, it would only get worse. He couldn't let Chuck get away with this. Not without addressing the larger issue at hand.